Good morning. My name is MIREIA LLOBERA and I am a senior professor at the University of Valencia. My presentation relates to labor mobility and free trade rules as a new challenge for the 2030 agenda. Let me start with the presentation of the theme. With the arrival of the third millennium, industrial society has given way to a new services society. Merchandise trade loses footing, and in contrast, exchanges of information, services, and productive factors such as capital and labor are today a powerful glue into the global economy integration process. In fact, the European economy may well be classified as a tertiary economy, as this sector absorbs 70% of the GDP and employment of the European Union, which highlights the economic and labor omnipresence of services. This boom in free trade in services at the European level caused a social earthquake around the so-called Bolkestein Directive, while within the scope of the World Trade Organization, it resulted in the worldwide adoption of the General Trade Agreement on Services, or GATS. This general agreement establishes 4 modalities for the provision of services. First, services in Mode 1, which are provided in another country, mainly through new technologies. Services in Mode 2, which are provided to a consumer that moves to another country. This is the case of transferring a patient to another country to receive medical treatment there. Then we have services in Mode 3, which are provided through the establishment of a subsidiary in another country. And finally, we have services in Mode 4, which are provided through the displacement of personnel from a company to another country. Therefore, in Mode 3 and Mode 4, said agreement regulates the temporary movement of workers within the framework of the provision of services. Likewise, European Union law regulates the transnational movement of workers under Directive 96/71/CE on posting of workers. Indeed, one of the most controversial issues surrounding this liberalization process concerns the problem of social dumping associated with the temporary movement of workers, also called posting of workers. In this sense, social dumping in the tertiary sector causes an inverse effect to that of industrial relocation, since in these cases, what is imported from abroad are the working conditions themselves, since the services must usually be provided in the same place where the demand is. For this reason, social dumping caused by free trade rules is considered in this study as a new challenge for the 2030 agenda. Further, as per the methodology used to carry out this research, this study compares different legal sources that deal with the temporary movement of workers regulated by the Directive 96/71/CE, and that will allow us to show the normative confluence between the directive and the services general agreement, as well as the correlative distancing of the agreement from the legal technique of international social norms. This evolution in the relationship of forces and influence of international instruments in commercial and labor matters is a faithful reflection of the process of legal extraction of labor standards related to migrants in this area. In fact, originally, the temporary movement of workers or posting of workers was framed within the scope of protection of the free movement of workers in Article 45 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. However, it has subsequently been subject to a legal kind of transfer to the regulatory arena of the free provision of services. Hence, we try to verify where Article 56 of the Treaty on the Provision of Services is an appropriate legal basis from a systematic and epistemological perspective to regulate this labor institution. The directive thus reveals itself as a confluence of both European freedoms. This ambivalence is an ideal starting point from which to address the legal treatment that the internal market of services grants to that labor factor. This debate is currently conditioned by the relationship between the non-economic objectives of the treaty and the freedoms of movement that are based on a specific idea of efficient action in the global economy. Therefore, let me move on into the results of this study. In the services sector, the temporary movement of workers is inserted in formulas of productive decentralization. This is currently leading to the formation of a new model of production in the form of an enormous economic network which, on the one hand, individualizes the relationship of the workforce with the employer, and on the other, disintegrates this labor factor in the work process. Certainly, regulating the temporary movement of workers or posting of workers within the framework of EU commercial law requires new methodological tools to address a legal reality that has left the arena of social instruments, in particular ILO and the United Nations Standards on Migration, to become part of the regulation of trade in services. International standards on migration, except as we shall see the most recent ones, are not designed to regulate this type of labor mobility, and their rereading from a social perspective is increasingly hampered by the growing influence of the World Trade Organization. This temporary labor mobility is now governed by free trade in services rules. This is the case of Mode 3 and Mode 4 of provision of services under the General Agreement. The same happens with the European Union rules. A posted worker is not considered anymore as a migrant worker. Thus, mobile workers are deprived of the international legal status as migrant workers, which grants them a broad legal protection under ILO Convention and the EU Treaty. This means getting rid of the broad legal protection granted to migrant workers by ILO, whose pivotal principle is equal treatment, which also inspires the inclusion of the principle of non-discrimination in the Treaty of the European Union. As a consequence, ILO and European rules are losing foot as far as transnational labor markets are concerned. Moreover, European laws has far surpassed the GATS in terms of liberalizing capacity, especially if we take into account that the opening of markets to posted workers, regardless of their specialization or position in the company, continues to be an issue burning in the GATS arena. It is significant in this sense that the European Economic and Social Council has warned about the risk of reification of the labor factor as a result of the subjective extension of Mode 4 in order to incorporate the posting of unskilled workers. In conclusion, it is a challenge for the 2030 agenda, the fact that dissociating social protection of posted workers from the scope of immigration rules grants transnational companies free access to labor across borders without being subject to the legal limits imposed to typical migration. This implies, in the case of intragroup mobility, to select workers at origin, to post them abroad as long as the provision of services requires, and to resort to subcontracting or to temporary work companies when necessary. As we see, free trade rules confer new rights to transnational operators. Similarly, free movement rights under EU treaties hold a legal status similar to human rights. Such fundamental freedoms sometimes collide with governments' attempts to oblige multinational companies to comply with social standards. In this sense, the discourse on human rights is reversed. Traditionally, human rights regulations have aimed at preventing abuse of the power by transnational companies. Now, instead, the discourse contemplates companies as holders of rights originally conceived for the protection of natural persons, and particularly migrants. As a result, corporations are implementing such rights to scrutinize the exercise of governments' decisions on economic matters. And finally, as I cannot go further and the 10 minutes limit has arrived, I would like to acknowledge the financial support received by the Spanish Ministry on the research project on posting of workers, desplazamiento transnacional de trabajadores. And of course, I would like to thank the organization of this excellent Congress. And so thank you very much for your attention.